Humanity's potential for cruelty and oppression is painfully illustrated through the history of slavery. Forced labor, corporal punishment, and other forms of degrading treatment were commonplace for enslaved Africans and their descendants in the United States from the colonial era through the antebellum period. In today's video, we will dive in on the history of black male slaves' exploitation and suffering, which has been mostly ignored. This story will open your eyes to the power dynamics inherent in the sexual interactions between white women of the planter class and black males of the slave class. The white women who participated in these relationships used sex as a tool of power to uphold white supremacy and patriarchy throughout this bleak period. Before we get into the meat of today's episode, we'd appreciate it if you press the like button, subscribe, and share to continue spreading these enlightening topics. Women who were second in command only to their husbands ran the plantations during this time. On the plantation, they oversaw the work of every slave. They were very powerful, and they utilized it to their advantage by abusing their slaves. Exploitation of slave sexuality was an accepted practice, and slaves' private parts were often utilized to satisfy the passion of plantation masters. Slaves, especially women, would be beaten for the smallest infractions and made to stand in the hot sun for hours at a time. Harriet Jacobs, the author of Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, was a former slave who experienced life on the plantations and wrote about her experiences in her autobiography. The slave girl is brought up in an unsafe and sexually permissive environment. Her education comes from the gnashing of her master's teeth and the vile babble of his sons. The owner, his sons, the overseer, or possibly all of them, begin to bribe her with cheap gifts when she is 14 or 15. If those don't work, they whip her and starve her to submission if necessary. The white planter wives were secretly unhappy with their lives, even though they were expected to keep a positive attitude and obey their husbands, while their husbands had many affairs with black slaves. Being forced into the role of a submissive wife was a huge blow to their egos, and they hated themselves for accepting it. When their husbands went away on business trips, the wives became extremely bored and looked to the male slaves for companionship and to fulfill their carnal needs. Housewives typically marry young, about 15 or 16, and spend their lives feeling isolated and unhappy within their homes. Mistresses and slaves had affairs considerably less frequently than their husbands and female slaves. It's not that white mistresses and black slaves didn't have romantic connections. They did, but the details were largely unknown. Women repressed their desires until their husbands' frequent trips led them to this entanglement. They were miserable and alone, and they needed someone to fulfill their deepest wishes. Like their spouses, they indulged in sexual activity outside of their marriages. Having children of mixed race was one of the major risks associated with white planters' wives getting intimate with black slaves. Methods of birth control did exist at that time. However, they were not widely used. To avoid having children, people used condoms made from oiled silk and rubber, and other forms of birth control. Her account shows that abusive, intimate exploitation of black slaves was common. Some mistresses decided to exploit their slaves in this way out of boredom, while others did so because they were fed up with their husband's domineering personality. So they did with slaves what they could not do anywhere else. Because they lacked authority in other areas, they rationalized their pursuit of low passions as a means of making up for their shortcomings. An intersectional analysis helps us understand how people can hold low status in one social arena while holding high status in another. This draws our attention to the ways in which multiple and sometimes conflicting sources of oppression and power are intertwined. It was common for mistresses to coerce their black slaves into sexual activity. Captain Richard Hinton said, "I have never found a black slave whose confidence I have won, who has not told me of instances where he has been compelled, either by his mistress or by white women of the same class, to have a carnal knowledge of them." Harriet Jacobs also discussed the mistress's use of the black slave as vulnerability for sexual gyne. They are aware that their father has absolute control over the slave woman and, in some situations, even the male slaves under their care. I'd personally witness it, the household's patriarch hiding his face in shame because his daughter had chosen the most vicious slave on the estate to father her first offspring. She didn't try to woo anyone who was on par with her, not even the smartest servant at her father's field. She picked the most beaten down among them so that she could exert her power with the least risk of being discovered. Women at home were responsible for upholding Christian principles and keeping the peace in the household. Virtuous and capable in their motherly roles, they were highly prized for their contributions to the upkeep of the estate. The dominant patriarchal culture and the law strictly controlled the mistresses' sexual lives. The consequences for adulterous females were harsher than those for adulterous males. Having children outside of marriage was seen as a major flaw among white planters' women, but not among black women. Hence, housewives were often subjected to harsh criticism. White planter women, especially upper-class white women, were seen as having superior morals and were assumed to be chaste in all areas of their lives, including the bedroom. They were expected to behave in a low-key and reserved manner while tendering to their husband. As widely rumored and confirmed by Jacobs, there was not a shred of white women's chastity, and girls on the plantations had completely different attitudes and appearances. Go to a southern plantation and pretend you're a Negro merchant. If you still have any doubts about the evils of slavery, nothing can be hidden from you then, and you may experience things you never thought conceivable among humans with eternal souls. The narrative of the chastity of white women and their superiority over black women, who were stereotyped as engaging in lustful behavior, was used to legitimize the exploitation of the intimacy of dark-skinned slaves. Because upper-class women saw themselves as superior to black women, they justified giving in to their own sexual desires in this way. The dominant culture and the frequent absence of their husbands made it difficult for them to fulfill their sexual needs. An affair with a black male slave was considered a huge disgrace to her and her family. There were cases where some mistresses were pregnant and afterwards went to considerable lengths to hide it. Such scandals that required social condemnation or public humiliation were extremely unusual, but occasionally unavoidable. Charles Ball, who had an affair with the daughter of a wealthy planter, revealed in his autobiography that some children of mixed race were born because of the love of mistresses and slaves. After giving birth, the girl's father imprisoned her and forbade her from breastfeeding. She was demoted from her position of social prominence, and her child was sold into slavery, all to prevent scandal. Sadly, infanticide was necessary to prevent further enslavement of children. After allowing their spouses to treat them slightly better than slaves, they became understandably resentful of the treatment they had received. They had very few personal freedoms and were required to always travel with a male chaperone. Female subjugation was explicitly written into the colony's legislation from the beginning, as detailed in the Low Country Slave Codes. A law passed in South Carolina in 1701 stated that slaves who escaped their master, mistress, or owner would be castrated if they attempted to escape again. And a law passed in 1740 warned owners that they would be held legally responsible for the well-being of their slaves if they did not provide them with adequate clothing, covering, or food. Slave owners in Georgia risked hefty fines if they employed slaves without the proper documentation. Other clauses describing the civic duties of slaveholders, such as providing members for the colonial military and sending slaves to construct public works, also included wording that was inclusive of women slave owners. Due to the insecurity of colonial life, many male breadwinners died at a young age, and as a result, some women acquired remarkable economic independence through their ownership of slaves. These women were able to achieve economic independence by running huge plantations on their own, and by freely buying, selling, bequeathing, and hiring slaves, which allowed them to assume leadership roles in their communities. Knowing that the Southern patriarchy was antagonistic to women's independence, these slave-holding single women safeguarded their privilege by perpetuating the same racist structures that gave rise to slavery in the South. Even though wives' persons, slaves, and possessions, enslaved or otherwise, technically belonged to their husbands, the reality was more convoluted, since wealthy ladies often entered marriage with slaves provided to them by their parents. Former slave Silas Glenn, recalled that his mistress was kind to the slaves who had come to her through her father, but cruel to those who had come through her husband. Many wives of slaveholders rejected their husbands' efforts to control, discipline, or sell their slaves. When it came to their marriages, white women who had been raised to command slaves felt confident expressing the autonomy that came with their newfound awareness of themselves as slaveholders. Some were shrewd businesswomen, true market mistresses. Mrs. Annie Poor, for example, sold slaves for high prices after teaching them to cook and build. Contrary to popular opinion, these women did not just study slave prices and profit from market swings. They either attended auctions themselves or recruited male representatives to do so. Slaveholding women, whether single or married, obtained economic power and autonomy under an oppressive patriarchal society by owning and oppressing slaves, whom they viewed primarily as property. Some white women also engaged in sexual misconduct with slave men. Thomas Belsersky argues that the same factors that encouraged violence against white women also encouraged it against enslaved men, including access to enslaved bodies and the use of sex to preserve racial and social power structures. He points out that contemporary observers remarked casually on this, using Harriet Jacobs as an example. Jacobs believes that some mistresses learned to wield control after witnessing the submission of female slaves to their father's authority in all matters. Jacobs recalls a woman who, in order to exert maximum control over her slave and avoid being caught, picked the most brutalized slave on her estate as her companion. Although this type of connection was rare, it exemplifies how white women internalized and often enacted the social hierarchies of race, sex, and power. The statement, "Sexualized abuse did not always involve rape," is accurate. Morgan notes that in the South, where some slaves were required to wear only the barest minimum of clothing, even routine interactions took on an oddly sexual overtone. The exposure of black male bodies in the presence of upper-class white women shocked Northern observers like William Harding. Harding said he saw enslaved men wearing only a loose shirt, descending halfway down their thighs, waiting on ladies who did not appear to be embarrassed by the sight. Mistresses also violated their slaves' privacy by beating them while were naked or by demanding massages or other private ministrations. It appears that some white women, like their male counterparts, were aware of and exploited social preconceptions, linking blackness with sexual aggression in order to ensure their silence after the fact. Collectively, these incidents show how white women acquired transgressive power by dominating and violating the bodies of slaves in a system that denied them sexual agency. Exploring how white women abused black male slaves sheds light on a disturbing aspect of history that has been mostly ignored or covered up. Leave your thoughts in the comments and stay tuned for more. Thank you for watching. See you in the next one.